Nachi free.
All dictators are psychopaths, but not all psychopaths are dictators.
Chato, bantangiringuay.
That's right, Scully. Supposedly 1% of the population are psychopaths, that is 1 out of every 100 people. That's a little fun fact that I read in a magazine that I was too cheap to buy at the grocery store, so I took a picture of the cover and the article in case you think I'm full of shit. But what was really illuminating to me in that article was how dictators surrounded themselves not with just yes men too scared to disobey them, as most people assume, but they would surround themselves with lesser psychopaths lusting for power as well. By the way, psychopaths are not to be confused with sociopaths. There is a lethal difference. While they both exhibit antisocial behavior, the main difference is that psychopaths are more willing to torture and kill other human beings, sometimes out of sheer curiosity, whereas sociopaths are more likely to lie, cheat, and steal for their own gain without remorse, but aren't willing to go so far as to torture and much less murder. And that's when I had an epiphany. Aha. Dictators like Fidel Castro and especially Adolf Hitler were alpha psychopaths who knew how to exploit beta psychopaths. Now, I know that Fidel Castro's crimes against humanity pale in comparison to the Holocaust, but if Fidel Castro were Hitler, then his rat-faced brother Raul and that douchebag Che Guevara were the equivalent of Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels. And it's not too far-fetched to compare Fidel Castro to Hitler. I don't want to engage in false equivalences like so many pretentious, pompous Poindexters in the media have compared Donald Trump to Hitler. But in the case of Fidel Castro, the parallel makes sense. After all, one of Fidel Castro's most famous quotes, "History will absolve me." Yeah, considering how many Hollywood hypocrites are willing to make excuses for this asshole, that little phrase was also a quote by Adolf Hitler, which Fidel Castro seemed to admire. He was known to have walked around with a copy of Mein Kampf in his college days. Now, I know that may sound doubtful, but it's not for nothing why Fidel Castro chose to don his military fatigues for most of his career as a murderous dictator and referred to himself as El Comandante, much like Hitler did by parading around in his khaki-colored accoutrements while referring to himself as the Führer. And that's what has always confused the hell out of me. How was it possible for dictators like Hitler and Castro to almost single-handedly wreak so much havoc and irreparable harm? How did they manage to convince so many people to become as evil as them? Well, they didn't need to do much convincing. They just needed to do a little bit of recruitment, like a job agency. Psychopaths like Castro and Hitler instinctively knew they could find and count on fellow psychopaths among the population. Like these. For the few people who've watched my videos, thank you by the way, you may have noticed that I've used this picture over and over again when trying to make my point about the shameless beatdowns of Cuban dissidents, many of whom are women and elderly and black. Yes, I want to point that out for anyone who holds up Fidel Castro as some twisted model of racial equality in Cuba like Jesse Jackson has. Opportunistic hypocrites like him damn well had to know what Fidel Castro was up to back when he took this picture smoking a cohiba with El Comandante. Gee, I wonder if that would make Jesse Jackson a psychopath himself. But let me not get sidetracked. The real point I want to make with this video is how one man can rule over millions against their will for decades. How just one man and 1% of the population can turn the rest of society on itself, almost to the point of cannibalism. How they can deceive families to tear themselves apart and report each other to the authorities simply for political reasons. I've only got a few more anti-Castro tirade videos in me, so I like to dedicate this one to the memory of my parents. Growing up here in Miami, Florida, whenever relatives would gather at each other's homes, they'd always talk about how everything was so much better in Cuba. The sand on Varadero Beach was so much finer and whiter than the dull gray shores of Miami Beach. The palm trees were greener, the streets were safer. Hell, even time seemed to pass by slower in Cuba. And as a kid, I had an identity crisis. I wasn't sure if I was American or half Cuban or even Spanish since I was born in Spain. And after a while, it would just frustrate me. And I'd tell my dad, well, God damn it. If everything was so much better in Cuba before Castro, why don't you finally go and kill that son of a bitch? How difficult is it to put a bullet through this motherfucker's head once and for all? And my mother would chime in and say, ay niño, no digas eso, que matar a otro ser humano es el pecado más grande que uno puede cometer. And my dad would respond, sí, pero ese hijo puta se merece que le metan una bala por la cabeza y otro por el culo. Si yo tuviera la oportunidad, yo lo mataría con mis propias manos, cojones. But needless to say, my dad never killed him. And neither did anyone else. Not even the CIA, who was indirectly responsible for this douchebag achieving absolute power in the first place. And yet, ironically enough, I would still die for the indisputable freedoms I know the United States affords me, despite the many questionable covert practices of the CIA, which I have the liberty to criticize, for example. The bottom line is, men like my father were decent human beings that might have had it in them to kill another man in a time of war or out of self-defense. But my father didn't have it in him to murder other innocent people, and much less watch children prostitute themselves just to get by so he could secure his totalitarian rule. And I believe that was Fidel Castro's secret to absolute power. His willingness to imprison, torture, murder, and watch millions of people needlessly suffer without a second thought lest anyone got in his way, and thus set the example for less ambitious psychopaths who would mindlessly follow his orders to get a taste of hand-me-down power for themselves. And that's how and why despotic dictators like Castro and Hitler, and nowadays Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Recep Erdogan in Turkey, or Kim Jong-un in North Korea stay in power. And they'd also be willing to murder any other useful idiots and apologists like Jesse Jackson, Oliver Stone, Bernie Sanders, or Jill Stein, to name a few, who are willing to sing Fidel Castro's praises to this day and overlook his regime's unconscionable crimes against humanity for a cheap photo op.
Boring dudes.
You're right, Scully. Let me wrap this up. I hope the other 99% of humanity that are not psychopaths finally see dictators for what they really are, so we can collectively bring them to justice. That way, maybe more people in this world can enjoy the same level of peace, prosperity, and freedom we have here in the United States. And maybe we won't have to fight any more wars abroad, and much less help install other psychopathic dictators through covert CIA operations in foreign countries before welcoming their war-torn refugees and immigrants to our dull, gray shores. Thanks for watching.
Homegrown.